make sure that they know that you want to encourage that. And it's not just a, hey, we need a babysitter. It's like, hey, we want our granddaughter to have a memory
Yeah.
of riding a roller coaster with her granddad.
Well, welcome to the True Man Podcast. Now, do you like to reminisce? Now, if you're anything like me, I love a good story. I love hearing about history and learning about how things used to be. In fact, I would dare say, with all this computer stuff and AI and all that garbage, that there was a better time and place for sure to grow up and live. But who do you turn to find out about all this history stuff? Well, your grandparents, of course, but today we're going to turn our attention to grandfathers. So welcome to the True Man Podcast, Greg Payne. Now, Greg has a podcast called the Cool Grandpa Podcast, and he's an author. And I love his mission because, well, he's fighting for grandpas and making them relevant. And how do you not like that? Greg, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you, Mike. I really appreciate being on the True Man Podcast. And this is going to be a very fun conversation because, I'm a young grandpa. And so we're diving into some unknown territory, so to speak. But this is awesome.
Well, yeah. When I first looked you up and then we had a conversation, I'm like, who's this guy talking about grandpa? I mean, he's way too young. And then it occurred to me, holy God, that could actually be me. So tell everybody, Greg, how did you fall into this whole Cool Grandpa podcast thing? Talk to us about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I was becoming a grandfather, and what I mean by that is when my son and my wonderful daughter-in-law decided to make me a grandfather, I started looking around and thinking about mentors that I've had in my life, my own grandfather that I had a great relationship with, and also noticed too that in popular media, even in like classical novels and things, grandfathers tend to either be comic relief or they tend to be villains. And in an isolated context, perfectly fine. Hey, I'm happy with Christmas Vacation when grandpa comes in and starts the Christmas tree on fire, kills the cat, all that stuff. Love it. The problem that I was starting to think about was that if that's the only thing that we really hear about grandfathers, that they write out a check for birthdays and Christmas, and then they kind of sit in the background. It's like, wait a second. When I talk to people like yourself, when I talk to other people, and they're like, my grandfather was an inspiration to me. My grandfather really encouraged me to go into whatever field they went into. However that relationship was, it's like, wait a second, grandfathers are an important part of the family unit. And that's a little like saying oxygen's important. And I get it, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, nobody's really out there waving the flag going, hey, let's talk about grandpas. Let's talk about how important they are. And we love grandmas, of course, but grandpas are really taking much more of an active role in the family. And I think that's a good thing. We're not necessarily staying behind the scenes, having the just quiet moment and then letting grandma take over that relationship. It's grandfathers are really starting, I think, with the baby boomers and then Gen X, stepping into this role of being a family historian, a mentor, a teacher, moving into that sage role, which can be an absolute blast. And so that's why I wanted to jump in and start talking to grandpas and start talking to experts about grandpas, is to, wave the flag a little bit. Let's talk about this.
It's interesting. And you and I have had a couple of different conversations and you're waving the flag for grandpas, and I'm trying to wave the flag for men in general. And, hearing you say that, I mean, are grandfathers also a symptom of just what's going on culturally, this attack on masculinity, maybe to where men aren't held in the esteem that you and I feel like they should probably be lifted to? I mean, because if you watch a lot of movies, it's not unusual for them to be making the father in the family along with the grandfather. I mean, we could pick on Chevy Chase all day long, but that would be a different podcast. But I mean, Clark Griswold, right? I mean, look at that. I mean, is this a larger symptom of just men sometimes being, I don't want to say demeaned, because that sounds,
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And what I mean by that is coming to a realization that there's some behaviors that have culturally been acceptable. And now we're saying, hey, that's not acceptable. And instead of saying, hey, let's cut this one piece out or let's modify this one area that men tend to do, it's, the messaging can sometimes be all men are bad unless they're really feminized. And that's not a great thing. And to your point, it, when you look at TV shows and movies and everything in isolation, it's not a big deal that the guy's the butt of the joke. But when it's constant, right? It's every commercial, it's everything. Because I remember watching the reruns, but the old Blondie movies that were really set like in the 40s and very, very early 50s. Dagwood was the guy that was just stumbling through trying to make his way. Blondie was there to save him and patch things up at work, make sure he got his big old sandwich on time, things like that. So it's not exactly new, but at the same time, it's I think it's the amount that's coming out. And so I think grandpas can get caught up in that a little bit because it's a little bit of not sure how to interact or what do we do with our daughters and daughter-in-laws and how is our role within the family as culture continues to change. And culture is always changing. I mean, ever since Adam and Eve, culture has always been changing. It's just one of those things we go through. But yeah, I do believe that, men in general, grandfathers in particular, were part of getting thrown out with the bathwater. And I don't always think that's intentional, but I think it's something that's happening. I mean, there's certainly some folks that, they've got their mindset on that, but I think sometimes it's just a little bit of like, hey, we want to modify some behaviors, change some things up, get dads more involved in the birthing process, get dads more involved in raising the kids and changing diapers and all that's good stuff. But then when you throw out all the positive side of what men bring to the table in relationships, then, I think that that's where we run into trouble.
Well, talk about that. What is the role? What can be the role of grandfathers, and how do we get them more actively involved in the family unit?
I think grandfathers tend to be natural leaders. We've gone through, we've fought we went out, slayed the dragon to provide for the family.
Right.
We dealt with the terrible twos, the tantrum threes, the teenagers. We survived all that. We somehow figured out a career. We figured out how to pay a mortgage, how to pay rent, how to get a car. And we figured out a lot of life. And we're pretty bloodied up by it.
Yeah.
But we've got that experience. So now what we can do is really start to coach and mentor our adult children. And that's not telling them what to do, but it's listening to them when they go, hey, we're thinking about moving here. Should we do this type of mortgage? Should we do that type of mortgage? Your insight is important with that, but you don't tell them what to do. But and the same thing goes with the grandchildren, right? When they're little kids, grandpas, get down on the floor, have those tea parties, play Hot Wheels with the kids, learn what they're doing. As they start to become teenagers, you can give them some of that life experience and some of that leadership, and maybe even help coach those teenagers to when, they're giving mom and dad a bunch of grief and a bunch of trouble. You can quietly go over and go, hey, you know what? You're being a bit of a butthead. And here's what I'm seeing. And you know what? And you just kind of leave it that way, right? Because the teenagers, you got hormones going on, you got peer pressure, you got everything going on. Having somebody that loves you and is looking out for the best of you, that can call you out on your stuff, is huge, as well as that encouragement piece. So I'm not just saying grandpas are there to carry a little bit of a stick around, but we're also there for the encouragement. And that's what makes us valuable, and that what helps to make us leaders within the family.
Now, what about the grandfather that maybe takes a more passive role? Not intentionally, not intentionally. It is a little bit more passive and doesn't know that they, are the sage guy that they really are. How do we activate them or approach them and say, hey, because some of these guys, but it's been my experience, we've talked about this a little bit, that some of these grandfathers, they sometimes kind of check out. Like, okay, I've done the work, and they don't necessarily recognize what they can bring to the table in terms of a lot of the advice that you're talking about, or taking an active role. So how do we initiate with some of these guys?
Yeah, and that's not uncommon, Mike, is that you do get a group of people that are, hey, I've raised my kids, I've done my piece, I'm getting in my bass boat and I'm going to the middle of the lake, and call me if there's an emergency. But they're taking that role, or it may be grandma becomes so dominant in that relationship that they slide to the background. So for either one of those examples, what my suggestion would be is to really bring out what that importance of grandfathers is. And you do that by sharing stories and talking about how important this grandfather relationship was to this person, how important this relationship was. And if this is maybe a buddy of yours, you just encourage more engagement. You talk to them, this person may have some really incredible hobby that they're doing. And it could be like, well, hey, Bill, have you ever taken your grandkids out and done this with them? Have you ever, looking for those connection points, but encouraging that friend that might be a little bit more passive in that role of grandfather. The other thing would be too, is just, if you're in a congregation, if you're around, bring up the subject of grandfathers. Talk about it, whether it's personal experience, maybe there's a historical reference that can be used that, hey, this kid was absolutely lost. This person, was a high risk youth, and a grandfather, somebody that lived down the street or a long distance grandfather came in, put their arms around them, worked with them, and inspired them to turn their life around, make a difference.
It's interesting. I was hearing you say that, and I thought to myself, yeah, we don't talk about, I would dare say, just grandparents in general enough. I mean, it might come up if we go, oh, well, the Greatest Generation or the World War II. That's how we tend to talk about it. And it seems like we really may be missing something there if we just approach it from that perspective.
Right. Well, and one of the things too with that Greatest Generation was they went through the Depression, they went through World War II. The combat vets saw things that we couldn't describe, and there's very little help for them. So having them come back and having, for us, our grandfathers not wanting to talk about it was how they dealt with it. They compartmentalized, they put it, and that's not everybody, of course. I'm using a lot of generalizations here. When we're seeing baby boomers and even silent generation. So silent generation, baby boomers, now Gen X, I think as we're starting to become grandfathers, and even when we were parents, there was more of a change of showing a lot more affection that, fathers were showing up to Little League practices. Fathers were getting involved. It wasn't just kind of there's one guy in town that wants to be a scoutmaster, so let him do it. And fathers are going to be checked out. They might show up at an award ceremony, but they're not around. it's now different. I mean, I've had some experiences with scouts where I had too many fathers showing up to volunteer. Like I needed 3 or 4 and I ended up with 8, which was great, but now I've got to find something to do with them. So that's a change, right? That's going
Yeah.
from, hey, grandfathers go into the other room, smoke some cigars, hang out, let the grandmas and the moms deal with the kids and the grandkids. And like I said, the old model would be like give some money here and there, maybe intervene on the kids' behalf if they're starting to go to college or into a career, and smooth the way that way. But now I think we're really been seeing fathers and grandfathers wanting to take a more active role and having it be okay, right? Because there's part of this where it's like, why are you doing dishes, Jim? That's women's work. Well, if I waited around for the wife to do the dishes all the time, we'd have a big pile of dishes. And I'm not trying to badmouth my wife. It's just one of those things like, hey, if you want a clean house, man, get in there and do some dusting, do some vacuuming. That's not women's work. In child rearing, in that caregiving role, like I think we're seeing a lot more men wanting to embrace that and be comfortable with it. It's just we don't have those great models that we can rely on. So as we're making these changes ourselves, it's we got to find models.
Yeah, I'm like you. I think some of this has evolved a little bit. I mean, I don't ever, in my mind, I don't think, oh well, it's my wife's role to run the vacuum or do the dishes. It's just that thought never occurred to me. I just jump in wherever I need to jump in, and go. And I think that that's been an evolution of primarily, really, 2 people working in a household, right? I mean, it takes a village to run a house these days when you got two people working. And I don't know if everybody's house is like mine, but comes dinner time and the texts start going off. Who's cooking dinner? What are we having for dinner? What are we eating? Type thing. And I always think the first person to initiate that should probably be the one cooking, but maybe that's beside the point. But I do think that there's been some evolution there, and I think I see it from grandparents also. They are getting more active in the family life? I mean, is that fair to say? Is that kind of what you see? They kind of adopted this lifestyle change that some of us have gone through.
Yeah, absolutely, Mike. And what I see too, and I think the research backs this up, is men are living longer. I mean, at the turn of the century, your life expectancy was like 46. I mean, unless you had really good access to healthcare and nutrition and things, it was like 46. We're now mid to upper 70s. We've got hip replacements and knee replacements and shoulder, all this stuff going on. So we've got, boomers, grandfathers, and Gen X. We're a lot more healthy than what we saw from the baby boomers and the silent generation in terms of what we can get down and do, what we can get fixed. And we're not working the fields as much. I mean, as much as everybody talks about how important farming and mining and these sorts of things are, these are kind of dwindling areas of work. And so most of us now are knowledge workers, or we're doing something that doesn't require the same backbreaking effort that our grandfathers and those grandfathers did.
Well, Greg, I grew up in central Iowa. I grew up in farming country. I mean, to your point, when my grandfather had his farm, it was a very hands-on business. Nowadays, you can hop in the modern tractor, maneuver it around with your thumb, and read the GPS system and see the yields coming in. I mean, some of that's just kind of like mind-boggling when you think about it. And, so yeah, they're farming more acres, but the equipment, the seed, everything is so much more superior than what we had 30 years ago. It's not as manual.
Right.
You
Right.
know, it's not as manual. And so, that physicality that goes with something like farming is really turned into modern business. You take technology and it's a business.
Yeah, absolutely. And thinking about my own grandfather's farm and other farms too, right? Is that you would have to go out with a hoe and physically go hoe rows in that field. And those rows could be
Yeah.
maybe a tenth of a mile, maybe a quarter of a mile, maybe a half a mile. And you're
Greg,
all
I've
day
done
hunched
this.
over.
I've
Yeah.
actually done this. We back in the day we called it bean walking, and we actually physically went out in the field and detasseled corn. Yeah, that's right. You had to do this by hand. I know this is blowing some people's minds right now, but
Yeah, well, and then Mike, picture yourself at 60 years old needing to do that for your livelihood, and then trying to come in and play around with a bunch of 3-year-olds.
right.
Uh,
Uh,
eh,
yeah, the physical demand on a lot, even in manufacturing. I mean, we could point to manufacturing, even modern day manufacturing facilities today, and they're not the same manufacturing facilities that they were 30 or 40 years ago. Much of that has been automated. So um, and maybe that's a good thing from the standpoint of you know people being able to come home and be more of a family unit. Now, statistically, I don't know that it turns out that way, unfortunately, but I mean, in theory, right?
well, this is some of the good stuff that Hanna-Barbera with the Jetsons sold us, right? I mean, they totally messed us over with flying cars and
Yeah.
automated, robots. But some of that promise from the future of tomorrow, from the world's fairs and things about
Hmm.
freeing up time, is okay. Grandpas aren't as beat up generally as they used to be. And
Yeah.
we've got the technology. So my granddaughter and grandson live 500 miles away. So I can read them a book at night before they go to bed
Right.
using technology, where before, you know, if I wanted to talk to my grandfather, it was Sunday night after hours, and I was talking to him once a month, maybe, and jumping on the phone, and maybe it's just a quick hi and goodbye. Now I have the opportunity to use the applications and technology so that they see me, I see them, and when I go to visit, I'm not a stranger where it takes 2 days for them to warm up. They kind of have a good sense of who we are.
That's a really good point. And I think that's probably a pretty important point because, we also live in a time and a place where it's not unusual for us to be 500 miles away. Now, I grew up in a small town in the Midwest and I was surrounded by family. I mean, we were literally a handful of miles away from each other. And we could go, I could ride my bike over to my one set of grandparents' house anytime, easily. And so now we live in a world where, I mean, 500 miles for a lot of people is a drop in the bucket, right? And
Right.
so, being able to use technology for the for those that aren't afraid of it, right, is a pretty important tool that they should be using.
Absolutely. Because if you don't get in and start using it, and especially have the mindset of learning what your grandchildren are doing and where they're at, you're going to be left behind. So one of the biggest things that's really important for grandmas and grandpas is, uh, if your grandkids aren't on Facebook, find out where they're at if they're using
Yeah.
social media. If they communicate via text and not phones, kind of, it's sad, but you kind of have to get over that, because if you want that relationship with those teenagers, with even the young adults, some of the tweens, whatever they're at, grandparents, you've got to go get comfortable with that technology so that you can stay connected with them.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think it's important, because if you're not connected, you may be isolated. And if you're isolated, this gets into a whole other conversation that we probably need to have. Then we start talking about mental health to a large degree. And this is a worry that I talk about quite often, a concern that I have, because men are very good at isolating themselves in general. And I think probably older adults do this to a larger extent. Maybe you could speak to that a little bit, Greg.
Sure. One of the challenges that we have as we become older and as we become grandfathers is that we lose a lot of our connections.
Yeah.
Meaning that you retire from work, so you lost all your work buddies. Some of them you loved, some of them you hated, whatever it was, but you lose that, especially if you're going into the office. You also stop playing softball. Your knees and your hips and your arms and whatever it is, you kind of pull back from some of these amateur sporting leagues and sporting events. And it becomes really easy to become more and more isolated. And that's not a good thing, because men typically, it could be facts a little bit off on this, but the number one killer of men, older men in Britain, is suicide. And I think in the United States, it's extremely close too. And it's because we lose those connections. We lose being able to go and, as we warm up for a softball game, talk to somebody about how rotten our day was at work or how awesome it was at work. Right.
Right.
But you're out there for 5 minutes, and guys need to be doing something to be talking about feelings. I think that's one of the things too.
Yes.
Even therapists have really started to come around on, is that therapy is generally a little bit more feminized, meaning you're sitting, you have a therapist on a chair, you've got yourself on a couch or a chair, and you're sitting there trying to stare at each other and talk. And for a lot of guys, it's really uncomfortable. I think one of the things therapists ought to look at is have a project car associated with their office, so that we're going to go out and work on these spark plugs. And while we're working on these spark plugs, we want to talk about your feelings and what's going on in your life and everything else. And so being able to find that connection. So even if it's starting to transition into finding a group that you can go play chess with, finding a group where you can start to volunteer at, any of these types of activities, because your family is not going to be a substitute for that network that you lose. Because quite frankly, sometimes you need to go share those wins when your grandchildren take their first steps. You need to share the wins when your grandson stops peeing in the bed at the middle of the night. You need to share the wins of the granddaughter that hit a triple in softball.
Yeah.
And it needs to be with people not within the family. And you also need that ability to go share some of the frustrations and some of the things going on with you. The scary thing where you went to the doctor and you had to have some tests done, and now you're waiting for a week or so to hear the results. And you're all over the place from an emotional standpoint. One of the biggest things that when I talked with an expert on men's mental health, there's this thing called men's sheds. And there's some of these organizations around, and what this is an organization where they've got woodworking equipment, they've got some metalworking equipment, and it's a way for you to go back and take your 7th grade shop class over again, and go learn from other men that are great at, spinning a bowl and carving out a bowl or building a basic cabinet or something along those lines. And it's a great way to get involved and do something different. So whatever that is, really grandpas need to be encouraged to make sure that they're connected and have a network outside of the home and outside of the family. So
I got to check out that men's shed thing. I never took a shop class. I was always involved in athletics, and I just am fascinated by people that are good at woodworking. I just think that is interesting to me. And I think partly, I I had a neighbor back in the town that I grew up with, and he was a shop teacher, and he used to do woodworking out in his garage. And I got to tell you, he was a pipe smoker. He smoked a pipe that had, it was cherry tobacco. And I'm telling you, I just thought when I was a kid, I'm like, well, I know I shouldn't smoke, but if I ever do, I think I'm going to have to go get a pipe that has cherry tobacco in it, because that just smells delicious. I can still smell that to this day. I mean, he would be out there in the garage smoking that pipe with the cherry tobacco. And I thought, wow, woodworking seems really cool.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm always jealous of those guys that build out their own wooden canoes and so much of that stuff. But I'm not so jealous that I'm going to go buy a planer and a router, a couple of different saws. You know,
Yeah.
I'm not there,
Yeah.
but I'm definitely kind of like, hey, if they got one of these things around my neighborhood,
Yeah.
I'd love to go check it out.
If it's a workshop thing, I might be interested. The last thing my wife wants to see me come home with is another hobby outside of golf. I think she realizes at this point I've spent plenty.
Oh yeah.
Spent plenty of money on that particular hobby. But I do want to go back, because I think you talked about the mental health study, the one that came out of Great Britain, and I've looked at this as well, because middle-aged men are taking their lives. It's the fastest pace middle-aged men in the United States, is from everything that I've been able to read about. And that's alarming to me, because it tells me that, you know, men at a certain point, they've been down a road. Now they've probably isolated themselves. They either haven't sought out help or haven't found the help that they needed. And it's as if they just throw in the towel. And so this whole idea of mental health, because you can't be a good grandparent if you're, you know, that middle-aged part of your life is, you know, you're exploring the suck, right?
Yeah.
And so this whole idea of mental health and men's mental health, and the fact that we're not finding ways to get with other groups of men, whether it be out of shame or fear or pride or whatever the reason is, it mystifies me, because I've found so much value in it. You know, I crave trying to find ways to get to those events. You know, I've got a Bible study that I go to on a Friday morning, and I seek out other ways where I can be around groups of men to learn from them. And I just think that that's critically important for other men to get around other men to learn, you know, about what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where I think we lose that network, and why I think grandfathers in particular really need to get involved in something. Find a couple of different volunteer activities that force you to go out and interact. The other thing too that you brought up that is so important is, and it's anybody dealing with depression, anxiety, or whatnot, it's fighting through and trying to get the energy to put on a smiley face when you go interact with your kids or anybody. I mean, we've all had those down days.
Yeah.
But your wife's work is having a dinner party. And so you've got to put on your big boy pants, put on a smile when you just want to cry, and can't be around anybody, and go and do that. And I just imagine that, you know, for men that are alone, maybe divorce, spouse passed, whatever it is, and then trying to be able to go out and do that, I think we really need to appreciate how hard it is, for people to rally and do that. And that's why I think too, grandfathers need to be on the lookout for people within their networks, and look for the person that kind of has a few of the, let's say, telltale signs of withdrawing a little bit, and where we need to go do a buddy check, right? We hear that a lot. is shoot out the text message. Hey, how are you doing? Haven't heard from you for a little while.
Yeah.
What's going on? Yeah. So that's kind of where I'm at with grandfathers, is like, hey, we all got to help each other, be on the lookout for each other, and we've got to get involved in new passions and new things that really excite us.
Amen to that. In fact, I was digging through some of my notes yesterday, as I'm sometimes prone to do, and this little phrase that popped up that I hadn't used in quite a while. You know, we need to have more caring conversations. I'm like, man, I love that phrase. I stole that from a consultant that was at the church that I was at. And I thought, wow, that's just genius. We just don't have enough caring conversations. I'm talking about the conversations that are more than an inch deep. And that's what you're talking about. And it's really important to do that in older adults. I mean, I know that the older I get, the more wackadoodle my body gets. And I'm like, my mind says I can still do something. And my body goes, hey, it's not really the best idea. And, I can only imagine what that looks like when I put another 10 or 15, years riding the horse here. So I think it's important that we have those buddy checks. It's a great idea. Greg, as we begin to wrap up, and I just want to make sure, because I think grandparents are such an important part of the family unit, an underappreciated sometimes part of the family unit. And, grandparents on both my side of the family, my wife's side of the family, we talk about them often. Some of them are no longer with us. And what piece of advice would you give people that maybe we didn't get a chance to talk about today on engaging with their grandparents?
Sure. So number one, I think with the adult children, if you've got a father-in-law that isn't quite as involved as you would like, sit down and talk with them about it. Let them know that you value your children having a relationship with them. Make sure that they know that you want to encourage that. And it's not just hey, we need a babysitter. It's like, hey, we want our granddaughter to have a memory of riding a roller coaster with her granddad, and, talking about how their ribs hurt afterwards, how she thought he was going to throw up all over her. Those stories, because when they're sitting around it 30 years later and they're telling the story, oh my gosh, my grandfather took me on this roller coaster and this is what that's important stuff. And so parents, tell those fathers and father-in-laws you want them to have that relationship. And spouses and grandmas, if you have a husband that's hanging back a little bit, talk to them about how to get them out in front. If you typically do the one that is always planning the trips and always is planning the get-togethers and all that stuff, start to give grandpa some responsibility and start to give him move some of that stuff off, your plate a little bit. And because if they're hanging back, it's probably because they don't know that they should be a little bit more out in front. And grandfathers, don't shortchange this relationship that you have with your grandchildren, because it's not going to be forever. And the thing is that I want my grandkids, when they're 50s and 60 years old, to be talking about all the cool stuff that they did with me and about the special moments that we had when they were falling apart. School wasn't going good. The relationship with mom and dad wasn't going good. The world hated them, but grandpa took me aside and we played some checkers, and he told me how much he loved me. And he told me that things were going to get better, that it was me and him against the world. And that's the thing that I want my grandkids to have. Sorry.
Yeah, I can see you were getting emotional there, Greg, and that's so beautiful, and that's what it's all about. that is absolutely what it's all about. And it's just so important to get active and involved in the lives of our families. And I just encourage all grandfathers and fathers, man, just get involved. Get involved. And you know what? Your family wants you involved, believe it or not. So
Yeah.
you may not believe that, but that's certainly true. Greg, tell everybody how they can get a hold of you and learn more about this whole world of grandparenting.
Sure. You can find me at cool-grandpa.us. That's the website. And then the podcast is the Cool Grandpa Podcast, and it's on iTunes and Spotify, wherever fine podcasts are sold.
Yeah. Yeah. All over the place. I just say
Right.
every major podcast channel. Greg, thank you so much for coming on and discussing this. What a fun topic to talk about.
Well, I appreciate the time, and grandpas, get out there, get in the game, and have a blast.
There you go. Thanks a lot for being on, Greg.
Thank you.